It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. I feel very fortunate to work with Lesley and on her team. I always know that Dr. Tate-Gould is going to bring her best, whether it's to her team or to her clients. And no matter what else is going on, in our personal lives, in the world, she always shelves all of those things and really takes the time and brings that energy, which I think is so important, for our clients to see, and also for those of us who work with her. Attitude reflects leadership, and she leads in such a way that I think really trickles down through the rest of us. And what I think is most important and a true blessing for me anyway is that she truly cares about our well-being as her team members, and not only fosters but encourages an environment of self-care, which I think is unfortunately kind of rare in this industry. So she puts our well-being first, and at the forefront of all of our job duties, which is so nice to know that as a team member here at Lido, we're all cared for from the top down. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our executive director and co-founder, Dr. Lesley Tate-Gould.
Thank you so much, Ariana, and thank you everyone for coming. This is a real treat because, as Ariana was describing, we had envisioned back in 2019 doing a CEU presentation once a month to just local clinicians, treatment associates and affiliates. And we got 2 under our belt, and it was a little bit of a slow start. And then, as we know, here we are a year out. And with the pandemic, all things, in person drastically changed. But what's really neat, and I'll be kind of touching on this, of course, during the presentation, is that now that Zoom and virtual platforms have become so normalized and such a part of our day-to-day lives, I get to reach so many more people. And, this learning opportunity gets to, just happen right in the comforts of people's offices and home offices. And so that's a real blessing. So as Ariana said, I am the executive director and co-founder of Lido Wellness Center. We're located in Newport Beach. And I'm also a clinical psychologist and a somatic experiencing practitioner. So you'll definitely see, and I'm enthused that your interest in this topic, as Babby was saying, it's an important topic. Also, will hopefully kind of generate some great discussion at the end and some questions, but also some information, really kind of talking about things like grief and loss in this year anniversary from, where us in the United States really became blatantly aware of these challenges during this time and have had to, make a tremendous amount of changes in our own life. But my hope is also to, really speak about, kind of how we can glean meaning, and also from that somatic perspective, how we can also really incorporate the wisdom and goodness of our nervous systems and our bodies. Because fortunately for us, that is something that is always trying to work with us, not against us. So I'm just going to do a quick screen share so that I can pull up my slides. And like Ariana said, these will be made available. We'll be sending an exit survey in order to get your CEU credit, and the slides will be made available there. So let me just do a quick screen share, because if any of you are like me, we like to be able to see things as someone's talking. And I'm also going to make this a little bigger for everyone. Brilliant. Okay. And as you can see, I was kind of refreshing myself with my slides. So we started off on slide number 3, but I'll back it up for just a moment. So some of the goals that I have for today's presentation are to really explore some strategies for dealing with uncertainty, loss, and grief. So identifying some creative outlets and coping strategies for enhancing acceptance and meaning making. And I'll be going over some of the stages of grief as they relate to and have been defined by David Kessler. And really introducing 1 to 3 body-based interventions to also assist with provider and patient nervous system regulation when dealing with uncertainty, fear, and shock. All right. So I'll first start out by, just talking about, the 6 stages of grief. And some of you may be familiar with this material, but I found that especially in the wake of the last year. And I think most of us on a call like this, and who have some type of formalized training in mental health services, or well acclimated into a treatment environment. When I go over these, we can really see specifically how these relate so intricately with what most of us, if not all of us, have in some ways been impacted by the events of the last year. And it's kind of fitting when I first talked with Ariana and Lisa Jane about when we wanted to do this relaunch, and that it happened to be on this day. It wasn't even a question in my mind. It felt very natural, given that we were headed into a year anniversary, to really be able to set aside some time to talk about this subject matter. But it didn't dawn on me until it was probably last night. I was actually doing some meal prep in my home, and I said to my husband, "Gosh, like this time last year, he and I had just returned. We were on the fence about going on a long planned weekend getaway, right as the world was coming to a grinding halt." And we went, and we were so grateful for that time to have been able to be together and really kind of just bearing witness to what was happening around us, and to be able to have the space and time as parents. Because for any of those who have little ones under their feet, you know what it feels like when, as parents, you don't get those opportunities very often when you're home. But it was really meaningful for us to be able to be together while we were kind of witnessing some of this, unravel. But the 17th in particular was kind of a really interesting day. So I'll just share a little bit of just where I was a year ago. When we had returned from that trip, we learned that our littlest one, so at the time was only one, was having kind of a treatment resistant fever, to the degree where on March 17th a year ago, I had to whisk her into the emergency department at Hoag because she had gotten so spiked. And it was such an interesting thing to, as a parent and also a healthcare worker, to be contemplating the safety of being able to enter a place like a medical center, like an emergency department, and really being uncertain, but also feeling compelled and out of just sheer necessity and fear, taking my daughter in. And, this part that I'll talk about in the stages of grief, as far as that shock and disbelief of having doctors, trained professionals, looking at me and my little one, who was running about 104 for several hours, say to me, "I don't know why you're here. If it were me, I wouldn't be here." And that was really startling for someone that, tends to be very conservative as far as it goes with, medical intervention. Really tried to live by, the life of, integrative healing and wellness practices. And so I'll just kind of lend that to these first stages of grief and denial, being shock and disbelief when a loss has occurred. There was certainly a tremendous amount of shock and disbelief, both at those moments, especially in that critical time. Fortunately for us, it just happened to be strep throat. So little one was just fine after she got some medication. But just that shock and disbelief of, wow, like, everything that we've known and everything that we've come to just be in so commonplace, we don't have that right now. And it was very disorienting. And I know I'm speaking for the masses when I'm saying some of this, that I imagine, not that I can see everyone because I'm looking at the slides, but there's probably a lot of resonance that's happening with just those very same feelings of disbelief. I remember for weeks after the closures started here in California, that I just kept even saying aloud, and I even wrote a later blog on this, "Wow, this is just such a weird time." And I just kept saying that over and over. And what I kind of referenced in that blog all those months ago was, it was as though my unconscious was trying to bring conscious all of this shock and disbelief. It was like it was trying to find a way for it to land and to simplify. And, language does that for us. When we are faced with things that are so unfamiliar and disorienting, we will call upon things like language to, what one teacher that I've heard references to, objectify it. And by objectify it, meaning to define it, to put parameters, or almost like a simplified box around it. So denial in this stage of grief, some of that shock and disbelief, especially when we're in that first phase of grief, sometimes it's almost insurmountable to even be able to put an objectifiable box of language around something. And I think we can all relate in our own personal experience with what we've gone through as a nation and just as a human species, that can be really hard to come across. With anger, this is another identifiable stage. And I do want to clarify too, as I'm going through these, and Kessler does brilliant work on this. I'm in no way on par with his level of expertise in grief, but I'm simply just kind of providing some summary as it relates to how, we've experienced and navigated this through as mental health providers and leaders since this pandemic. But the stages of grief are also not linear, of course. And so sometimes the denial that, so that shock and disbelief, it might actually start out, it might not start with denial, it might start with anger. And so, certainly there can be a lot of anger. And as it pertains to actual, and when I say actual, I mean the death and loss of a loved one or somebody close and familiar, there can be a tremendous amount of anger. That can at times kind of, I would say, vacillate and be kind of in this straddling position of denial and shifting into anger. Anger and disbelief of, how could this be happening? And sometimes, simultaneously with that anger, there can also be a tremendous amount of felt guilt. You know, a lot of us have come from living environments, familial relationships, even work relationships that are very complex. The human species, we're a very complex set of creatures. And so what can also happen is that we can also have a tremendous amount of guilt, which then kind of, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but can also then, lend itself to the stage of depression, because sometimes it is holding that dilemma of, I have so much anger that's coming up, or intensity, or even sometimes downright rage, but that I simultaneously might be feeling guilt because I'm also holding this juxtaposition of I've cared for this person, or they've cared for me. And so anger, especially during a grieving process, can for some be a very unwelcomed feeling of sorts. It can be kind of one that, when it's coming up, we want to maybe kind of push aside. And, truth be told, anger can at times for some groups, or, personal experience of how we might have been raised or how anger was modeled for us. Sometimes anger is something that we just really want to move away from. We don't want to have a lot of exposure to it. So bargaining, all of the what ifs and regrets. So this most certainly, when there is a loss of life, from somebody, with somebody that is treasured or close to us. I can think of the individuals that I've lost in my life, and there, one really stands out in my mind back when I was in high school, in which I lost a very close friend to a car accident, and we were supposed to hang out that evening. And so I would say with that particular loss, I was really riddled in that bargaining of, if I had only gotten a hold of her, if I had only been able to have her come with me instead of going out with this other group, that ended up resulting in her loss of life. And bargaining, and with all of these stages, it's a tremendously helpful experience. And so with all of these, you'll hear me use language a lot like normalizing. We want to normalize that bargaining, because again, in that similar way that our nervous systems will kind of call upon language when we're in that shock and disbelief cycle of grief, or stage of grief, bargaining does a similar fashion. So bargaining, to be able to explore all of those different options, it can allow us to feel as though we might have had some type of say or control in something that we actually had no say or control in. That was a matter of events and circumstances that we didn't actually get to have a say in, but that our logic and our framework, especially when we've lost someone that we care deeply for, as I did for this young woman, it allows us to kind of move through and notice, some of those regrets and those what ifs. Now, of course, and we'll go through this as it relates to the pandemic, we can also become quite stuck in some of these different stages. So while they're not linear and we can bounce in between, we can at times in our grieving process, if we're not given some space to really be witnessed and taken care of during these stages, we can also have some stuckness, which I'll kind of speak upon and even kind of make a correlation of how that could also eventually lead to maybe some unresolved issues related to trauma. So depression, stage of grief, sadness from the loss. Now this one, of course, now I say that of course, and then I want to add an exception. The of course that I was going to follow is this is at times more of the customary kind of identifiable or agreed upon framework of grief, that people experience sadness when they've lost someone that they care deeply for. However, where this stage can really hang people up is sometimes if you don't initially experience sadness from the loss, if maybe you're actually still between maybe a denial and anger or bargaining phase or some kind of vacillation between the three of those, sometimes people might view a lack of sadness in the expression of that loss as that you didn't have the same impact, or that person that was lost didn't hold the same loving impact in your heart. And I really, invite as practitioners, and I imagine people who have done any research or, have kind of a proneness toward really understanding the stages of grief and loss, actually have a tremendous amount of respect and validation for those that may actually not immediately access sadness. This one particularly gets tricky if there's a more complicated relationship. I've worked with, grieving individuals who have lost a family member, say a parent, but maybe that relationship with that parent was very tumultuous and potentially abusive. So at times, the immediate, stage of depression isn't felt because there's actually a lot of relief and a lot of shock and disbelief that kind of takes the place and superimposes there. So the former final stage that Kubler-Ross and then later David Kessler really championed was acceptance. So acknowledging the reality of the loss. The word that comes to my mind when I see a word like acceptance is one that we use in therapeutic circles a lot, which is radical acceptance, meaning that we can kind of hold in this dialectical framework the awareness that this loss is real, and there are all of these very, very real and predictable feelings and stages that somebody travels through. And simultaneously, there can be the deep awareness and acknowledgement of accepting that this person is no longer with us. But what I loved about, learning in the last year or two that Kessler has really put forth some effort and work in what I found such an exceptional resource on grief in his recent book, Finding Meaning, is this ability to have a transformation of pain into fulfillment, purpose, and hope. And for me, given that my background is in trauma and mood-related disturbances, for me, so often when I'm working with someone who is struggling with unresolved, kind of maybe even somatic features of trauma or emotional features of trauma and freeze, meaning is what we are most consistently aiming for as far as one of our kind of long-term goals. And I also want to clarify, and Kessler goes into this in great detail, and I really appreciate his detail here, is that in how he relates to it in the stages of grief, meaning is not finding meaning in the actual loss itself. And I'll also say that another way, as it pertains to trauma, it's not finding meaning in the potential act or experience of something dreadful, terrorizing, or harmful. It's what happens afterwards. And so that's such an important distinction because, especially, in our clinic at Lido Wellness, we are working, with some of the, in my opinion, most courageous individuals on the planet, but also ones that have been through a significant event or series of, kind of what we term in trauma world, trauma reenacted events. And so I would never look into the eyes of a sexual assault victim and say, oh, well, there was meaning in what happened to you. There was meaning in the time in which your physical integrity was compromised. No, it's what was happening afterward, and how have you, in your effort of maybe even coming into a treatment center like ours, attempted to and striving toward reigniting a deep sense of, as David puts it, fulfillment, purpose, and hope. And I think that's so, so vital here. So I, kind of touched on these a little bit, but what I really wanted to talk about, and just kind of in the unique ways in which this pandemic has, really at times lent itself and been related to these 6 stages of grief. For starters, the physical loss of life. And it's possible that even individuals right here in this very learning environment have actually had a loss of a loved one. And that could be, within their own family system. It could be at their workplace, or it could even be just a place that they frequent. And so most certainly, being in the awareness that having experienced something as catastrophic as this pandemic, there has genuinely been a significant loss of life. And so to just really being able to hold great witness and awareness to those losses. And most certainly also, and this also I'm gleaning from a recent conversation and presentation that at Lido we were able to be a part of, which was phenomenal. We were recently able to provide a presentation on trauma and related disturbances as it pertains to this COVID pandemic to a group of healthcare leaders through Kaiser Permanente. And one thing that, was spoken about in kind of the preparation of that meeting was not only was there the physical loss, of course, of a loved one, but also the inability for those surviving members to have any type of closeness or access to their loved ones during this time of passing. And Kessler also mentions this in his book, Finding Meaning. He provided an afterward kind of post original publication in response to the COVID pandemic. And I mentioned this in some later slides, that inability to be able to bear witness and say goodbye when people are close to losing life is something I would imagine that as trauma healers, we're going to be navigating through for years, if not decades to come. That said, I'll also say kind of also in that kind of framework, and this was also, kind of related back to me, just kind of, from some of my correspondence with healthcare workers, and also just, my like neighboring collaborators in mental health. It's also then simultaneously a challenge when, and I can only speak for my limited experience having grown up and lived in the United States my entire life. But in some of the workshops that I've been participating in since this time in the last year, we're also in a nation and environment in which there isn't a lot of emphasis or time being spent on the process of grief, on understanding these really nuanced phases and stages that we naturally go through. Now, because I work in mental health, I at least can, through my expertise and framework and all of the collaborators that I get to be around, I would say my experience of that is the exception, of course, because when you work, in a mental health environment, we have a robust language and background for understanding grief. So I'm kind of making that statement more as it relates to outside of, maybe health environments or mental health environments that hold some of that awareness. It's been told to me that at times, we can really be referred to as like a death denying culture. And so something like a global pandemic in which we are having to confront, and then also in these very less than ideal ways, it can really activate a tremendous amount of feeling, including, of course, that stage of grief pertaining to anger and bargaining, when people are not able to bear witness and be in those final stages of loss of life with their loved ones. That's taken a catastrophic and left a catastrophic impact on those around. What I put in capitals for all, how this relates to the pandemic and why, in Kessler's book and also some work that I've followed of his, why this relates to grief in such a big way is especially in that stage of denial and bargaining, this loss of familiarity, which can and has activated so much fear and uncertainty at such a global level. I remember in some of the early weeks after, we were, of course, ferociously watching the news and media to just see what was going on and what, resources we could really turn to for something that could really kind of glean some sense of familiarity or some promise of maybe restoring some hope. And I remember strategies I would take as a mom, in those early times, going to markets really early in the morning. Fortunately for me, I have always been a morning bird. So getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and waiting until, the designated times had passed for seniors and those with compromising conditions, standing outside, really feeling like the collective energy of this activated fear and uncertainty was pretty profound. And I remember coming into even my clinic during, our consultation times or when we were doing our staffing virtually. And I would just kind of check in with my staff, like, is anyone else feeling this? Is anyone else feeling, this sense of heaviness or almost like, kind of feeling like shoulders pulling in, or even just feeling in kind of more of an activated response rather than like a collapsed response, feeling heart racing, feeling racing thoughts when we're out, kind of moving amongst, our public spheres. I, fortunately, because of my work as a somatic experiencing practitioner and having learned about 5 years ago that I would identify as an empath, this type of resonance, it didn't frighten me. As maybe 5 years ago, not knowing those parts of myself, it might have been more frightening. But I really just kind of was curious with it and noticed that this is potentially my nervous system really feeling at a global level and kind of an overarching collective level, some of that activated fear and uncertainty. And it can manifest as moving quickly through the first 4 stages. So, for those of us in those early times, and we all have our own unique framework of what we did or what we didn't do, right? What we might have avoided during those times and where we might be now. There was probably, for a lot of us, kind of a circular rotation of sorts through a lot of those first 4 stages. So ways the pandemic has unearthed behaviors or symptomology associated with trauma. So this I came across back in October. So when working early with the pandemic, I learned of this from Raja Selvam, who is the founder of Integral Somatic Psychotherapy, ISP. And Raja, I don't know if he's still a faculty member for somatic experiencing, but he has gone off and has created kind of his own interpretation and kind of reimagining of somatic psychotherapeutic practice. And I was able to participate in this exquisite training back in October. It was a kind of a 3-day, 1 weekend, split into 2 weekends. But he was really articulating that when he was working with supervisors and also patients early in the times of the pandemic, there was a lot of discovery through his work of pre and perinatal trauma coming up for many patients and even providers in supervision. So what I mean by pre and perinatal trauma, because obviously this is pre-verbal trauma. So this is, material that most of us have only been made aware of through trusted family members or, through kind of our own analysis of records and, medical paperwork and that kind of thing. So Raja really talked about how, the impact of this pandemic, that it really hit for so many, and maybe without them even knowing it. One of our primitive and kind of pre and perinatal needs, which is our need of existence. And so in a state of development being existence, which is the 0 to 3 month mark. So in that existence framework, and so this is both so in that perinatal time, so pre-birth, and then in this 0 to 3 period, that when there are things happening that, may be, uncontrollable, environments in which there might be war or devastation, or, within our own family unit, if there might be or have been things like, kind of compromising stress response, maybe chaotic living environment, or maybe for some, if there was a real complication at the time of birth. And so in this training episode, we really talked about, for those, and we actually got to work with some case participants for training purposes who had actually had confirmation of this 0 to 3 month time in which they had undergone pre and perinatal trauma. So what I'm talking about when I mentioned, this stage of development, this existence stage of 0 to 3 months, and then even prior, that existential terror, fragmentation, and existential safety are key cornerstones of this developmental stage. And so why I thought it was so important to be able to share this with this group, and, and what's really influencing some of my research efforts are especially with the early stages of the pandemic, when we didn't know what this thing was, and we didn't know which groups were most at risk. We didn't start to really kind of put some of those pieces together with some of the careful, dutiful science and research and rigors that were happening kind of simultaneously as this thing was kind of taking over nation states. For many, it actually activated things like the terror of being able to be a human being with feet on the ground and be able to exist. What I mean by fragmentation is, at times, if we have had trauma during that pivotal time of our development, and again, this is pre-verbal, so it's not like a lot of us walk around and know this, and it doesn't come until much later, or with, again, kind of these dialogues that we might be having with family members. We may not know. And so we may not discover until maybe a present thing like a pandemic that none of us have ever experienced, at least in our lifetimes, that by fragmentation, what I mean by that is we can kind of split off, parts of us can kind of fragment in our awareness. So from like a trauma perspective, and even just, to explain that just briefly, again, I would need a whole other talk to go into each of these in far more detail that they deserve. What I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. Fragmentation can occur and we may not even know it unless we know what we might be looking for. So as a somatic experiencing practitioner, I often will see fragmentation happening in my clinic when someone will be talking about something that's pretty heated. And by heated, I mean, it might have kind of some trauma roots. It might be, some real easy to access activating material. They might be talking about an assault or an attack or a car accident or a medical injury. And they're talking about it as though they're giving me the grocery list. So that actually is kind of a marker of fragmentation, where they will be talking, their language will be going. Again, that is one of our fundamental ways in which, like I was mentioning from the early part of the presentation, we use language to simplify things. So they can be talking, but meanwhile, there's no resonance or recognition of what's happening actually below their neck in their nervous system. And I've even been accused of being disruptive when I'll put a hand up and say, oh, wait, let me check what's happening here. What are you noticing as you're telling me some of these things? And I've had patients like literally say to me, stop interrupting me. I'm in it. Like I'm talking about it. I'm giving you everything you need to know. And I'll say, but I wonder what's happening here, because my goal is to take what might have, out of necessity and out of safety, needed to fragment. My goal with trauma healing is to bring things into a greater sense of regulation and integration. So by slowing things down and kind of trying to bring those parts together so that they can be in more harmony and more congruence, that's a way in which, as we see from this pandemic, we're seeing kind of a more proneness to things splitting off. and existential safety. This is most certainly, this is especially for certain sensitive groups and age demographics. This is a much more dangerous and threatening presenting disease. And so, but before we knew that, right, before we had some of that research and rigorous science, we didn't know. And so, like I was saying earlier, when I was feeling all of that intensity just in the universe around me, it was like everyone was looking toward something that could kind of give us an anchor point of our own safety. So the polarity of existential worth and existential shame. So, this is kind of gleaned from that earlier presentation. So at times, if there's been trauma during those pivotal times, that chronic belief of not being able to be loved, and that the correction to that, the counter of that, it is a right to exist. It is a human God-given right. And that patients may have not, or even some of us within this own learning environment, we may not have had that God-given right granted to us. There might have been a lot of turmoil and safety and trauma in our upbringing, or of course, for those that we might work with in mental health. And so that would then signal some of this terror, this fragmentation and existential safety threat that the pandemic almost kind of turned a light switch on for people. And I imagine, again, I'll check in with the chat in a moment when I stop the screen share. I imagine there might be some questions on that because it's kind of it's a different concept. So of course, before we wrap, I wanted to provide the group. Now, again, I'm going to be kind of rolling through these quickly, but we could, of course, do some follow-ups if there was a level of interest or a desire to have some additional circling back to some of these. But these are excellent tools that we can not only use within our own systems, because remember, we are humans in the room too, working with this population, and we've been impacted by this pandemic, of course. So in order to provide some of that support and containment in the event that maybe something that has been activated, like existential terror fragmentation. And one of those is touching the region on our spine, that T3, T4 location on our spinal column. I loved learning this back in October. When I learned this piece that I'm about to share with all of you, and you can see on the slides, as a mom, it just left me feeling so more and more emphatic about just the wisdom of our nervous systems. This part of the spine is estimated to be the part that has the longest time of connection and development up against the uterine wall. So it's one of our kind of soonest to, kind of lodge onto that supportive part of that uterine wall. And so being able to reconnect with this part with, safe physical touch and pressure can be a tremendous offering to those, both for ourselves and for patients. And so bear with me because we're on Zoom. I'm going to try to demonstrate this. So I usually do, and I've done this with patients, usually got it like a 2 to 3 fingers. And really, it's kind of all of our systems, of course, not that T3 and T4 are different for all of us, but where you're going to locate this. So you're going to just try to find, and sometimes it can even help to just kind of Google that T3, T4 so you can find it. But it's just like kind of right between like where neck reaches shoulder blades, but before you go down into that scapular portion. And so you can kind of feel some of those nodules. So you're going to just want to apply just some gentle pressure. And so you can even do that with me, just to bring in some pressure and some awareness. And it's not to apply pressure to the point of pain or discomfort, but just enough pressure where it doesn't feel like you're touching it with a whisper. What I know also about raising children is there is a reason why things like swaddling exist. It's to bring some kind of supportive weighted pressure, right? It's why as trauma experts, we use weighted blankets. So it's to bring that pressure. The upper sternum and the top of the ribs. So bringing air and expansion and touch into this area to manage existential shame. I was just teaching on this yesterday to a patient, and one of my primary modes of kind of bringing some resonance and attending to this potential area where there might have been existential shame and trauma is to have a hand over heart, or to even have both hands over this region. And so for those, I can't see you, but you are more than welcome to join me here. And again, some gentle pressure so that you can really feel that contact. And I know when I do that, I feel kind of some delicious like movement down my shoulders. And so when I'm working with patients where there's maybe been kind of that key developmental stage trauma that's maybe been activated by this pandemic, the goal when I'm working with trauma is we're not trying to avoid or make the feeling stop, quite the opposite. But we are trying to allow that system to, with its own guidance and support and these key kind of touch points and focal points, we're trying to regulate that system so that we can proceed. And that we can, at times, in the long-term goal, restore a deep sense of purpose, agency, and meaning. And so I use this probably on a daily basis. I'll even find myself during a meditation practice, bringing my hands here. And then orientation muscles are at the base of the skull. So with fragmentation, if you are noticing, like in that example that I gave a few moments ago, in which somebody is talking about really, really challenging or, activating material, but they're just talking as though they're telling you what they're getting from the market later. You can just invite just a gentle pause as I did. And of course, having rapport with the patient is tremendously helpful here. Because again, if not, you risk, appearing as though you're trying to be interruptive. But all of these muscles here, and it's why we naturally orient. So by orientation, that's allowing our eyes to go around a space to be able to notice what's happening. So as I'm talking about it, I'm just trying to kind of demonstrate. And so it's bringing in some actual supportive movement into all of this musculature so that we can actually, again, bring some of that resonance and that regulation to that system. Now, of course, we would have to go into another hour of training on this. So if you want more information on orientation, I'm happy to oblige or, provide you with some resources. This is one of our, again, most intuitive resources that we use at our disposal. It's why when we are working with patients who have a trauma response, such as hypervigilance, it's why they will endorse things like, when I come into your office, I know exactly where the doors are. I know where the windows are. I know what's happening. That is literally their system using that musculature to give them that supportive resource to know that they are going to be safe, that they're going to be okay. It's a beautiful, beautiful skill. So some additional body-based or creative outlets for working with grief and working with trauma and how it might be in coming into your clinic and related specifically to the pandemic. So there's a joint expansion exercise, and just for the purpose of time, I'll just show you a few, I'll just show you wrist points, but then I'll kind of go through, and I might even edit this slide so that I can hit all of the points on the slide of what you would be targeting, both for yourself and then also for patients. So basically the wrist points, the joint areas throughout our system are areas that when we can bring space and expansion into these areas of our joints, we can actually dramatically kind of bring some regulation back into the system. A really great example of this, and this was fabulous, and it was one of those things where sometimes we see these exercises, or I know I do, and maybe I'm not alone here, I hope I'm not, and I'll think, okay, in real time, I'm seeing this as a demonstration. I don't know if this would actually work in real practice and time, but it absolutely did. A few weeks ago, we had a series of events and some critical events that were happening within the clinic with one of our patients. She's fortunately safe. But as a result, there was a lot of activation in one of the groups that I was leading, and a lot of the members were just really like, I don't know what's happening, and I'm feeling really scared and afraid. So we stopped what we were talking about in group, and I said, okay, we're going to try something. And I walked them through very meticulously this joint expansion exercise. And one gal that I thought for sure was going to poo-poo it, and she proved me wrong in that very moment, she said, I got to stop you because I did not believe this would work, and it's totally working. So that felt like such a therapeutic win, because again, sometimes when we're in an activated state, we can believe, oh, like nothing's going to work. It's just going to have to run its course. But this one really helps. So you're going to want to be doing some movement bilaterally. So if you're doing something on the right, you're going to be doing it on the left. And you're basically just going to be bringing in some very gentle movement to these joint points. And it's really with the visualization, and I share this visualization, and I do this with the patients while we're walking through. I don't just kind of send them out to pasture. You're visualizing expanding space into these joint regions. And so we do it with the wrists, we do the shoulders, the neck, the hips, the knees, and the ankles. And so I'll write all of those out. I'll update the notes. And basically you're just doing these ever so gently. You know, sometimes patients will want to really get moving and cracking. You want to really slow it down, because essentially what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to expand. We're trying to build some space in those regions to get new flow of information, new energy moving there. I'm going to skip meditation only because I want to end with that one, just as it pertains to one of my favorite chapters on meditation. But painting, dancing, singing, these are all things that can be called upon, even if we are still in times of lockdown or limited, social engagement and contact. These are things that we can dance in our living room. We can throw music on. We can paint. We can sing. These are all beautiful creative outlets that also kind of bring in greater awareness and flow into our nervous systems that can be phenomenally helpful with trauma and grief. Social engagement goes without saying, but of course, in the wake of the pandemic, this has been tremendously hard to be able to implement and utilize, especially if you do, or if those around you might have, if they might be in a sensitive age group, or if they might, have different, physical complications that might really make, direct social engagement a challenge. And so social engagement can look, in a variety of ways. I'm going to date myself, even though I'm not that old, but it is one of my oldest pastimes. And I loved it and I cherished it. And all of my grandparents are gone at this point. But social engagement can also be like letter writing. I loved letter writing. I used to letter write to my grandparents quite frequently. And so sometimes social engagement, we have to get more creative with it. Unfortunately, we're living in such a time in which Zoom and our virtual platforms are making this so much more accessible. But also being able to get outside, and even if it's just people watching, our species is what is called super social. And so and we're seeing this, right? We're seeing research kind of being released and revealed that this lack of engagement, this kind of having to shift and totally reorient to how we do things socially, it is essentially kind of outside of our evolutionary practice. And so now that things are, starting to relax a bit in certain regions, now that the vaccine is really making its way through, really reinstituting social engagement is so important for our regulatory system, for our vagal system. It's a tremendous resource. Practicing mindfulness and gratitude. So doing this, for those of you that, have this as a regular practice, this can be really wonderful. Gratitude is one of those things that's been proven in workshops and research and writings on happiness quotients, that happiness is determined far more from our ability to hold a tremendous deep resonant sense of gratitude, rather than having life events always work our way. Because as we know, we're all in this together, and most certainly this is a year that is paramount and not going the way that we had anticipated nor maybe wanted. Shifting focus from outlets that perpetuate terror, so things like news media, social media, really being wary of cognitive distortions that might include overgeneralization, relying on feelings rather than critical thought or black and white thinking. I, years ago, disengaged from social media outside of what's needed just for my kind of checking ins and doings for Lido wellness. And everyone's on kind of a different path as it pertains to their engagement with media. But just knowing that in times that maybe you want, maybe more reliable sources, books are here to stay, and, books are at times more oftentimes rigorously researched. So sometimes kind of shifting maybe to get information from books or peer-reviewed articles can be a helpful way to kind of reignite a sense of knowledge and power that comes with that, but not at times falling into sometimes the trap that media can put into us with some of those cognitive distortions. Restoring hope and meaning. Asking yourself in patience, what are some discoveries that you've made, since this time in this last year that you're grateful for? I think it goes without saying, grateful that this was happening at a time where we have technology in place that we can even do things like this, that for a lot of us, our day-to-day programmatic, capabilities were not that disrupted, which was such an exceptional gift and one that I'm deeply grateful for. Increasing mindfulness during connections. So shifting from multitasking and overscheduling to those cherished times where if you are socially engaging and in person with someone, putting the phone away, tucking it in a bag or a drawer, so that you can really glean and feel the profound impact of that re-engagement with our social connectedness. And then last but not least, before I go into just support managing loss of loved ones, I just wanted to read something quickly as it pertains to meditation. Meditation, like I said, I skipped over, but I wanted to bring it up. This is from Janine Roth, and it's from her book, Women, Food, and God. And it's by far one of my favorite chapters on meditation. And so she, just has an excellent chapter on it's called Married to Amazement, which just really, for me captures just the beauty that I really try to inspire with others with daily meditation. Most of the time I sit quietly anyway. And the second I get myself in my seat, the second I start being aware of my breath and the belly, there is an abrupt shift. The world of time I'd been inhabiting drops away. Everything I was rushing to do dissolves. Sounds become louder, sensations become stronger. Squawking birds, raspy breath, howling wind. Warm dog breath, creaking door, ringing phone, pulsing belly, tingling hands. And even that's beyond what it feels like, because what it feels like is that there is no difference between outside and inside. Suddenly, all the goodness everywhere is here. In the space that used to be me is amazement married to itself, which is why I still meditate every day and recommend that you do the same. I just love that part. Just, really bringing things into just great awareness. And so if you're not meditating, especially after what we've all been through as a collective nation and world, I highly, highly recommend. And then for support in managing the loss of loved ones, the physical loss, Kessler really mentions this at the end of his Finding Meaning work, speaking more openly about grief, finding meaning in end of care life, finding meaning in end of life rituals, and then grief online support groups. And I think I even have some resources here. So grief.com, research and online support for grief, founded by David Kessler. Kessler's book is here, Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief. And then if there's any questions regarding this presentation, you're welcome to contact me or Ariana. And then of course I put our website and our admissions line. Like I said, you'll get a copy of this, so I'm just going to stop the share so that way I can resume seeing everyone. And I will stop talking so I can answer some questions. I'm sure there were some. So thank you so much for everyone's participation.